Ladies and gentlemen, honorable judicators, members of the House then, and the opponents that are respected, a world where critical resources such as gas technologies, industries, or even global economical were dominated and exploited by just one country can make such a crisis, monopoly, dependency, and even conflicts. That's why today's motion is important because with this motion that states that critical resources should be managed and governed by the international agencies. Let's define today's motion first. First, critical resources is a resource that is limited including oil, natural gas, and rare earth element. Second, govern. What is govern mean? Govern itself means that something is managed, ordered, or influenced by some institution or organization. And third, international agencies. International agencies is an agencies that would act as a global organization. For example, that we have today is United Nations, World Health Organization, and etc. Ladies and gentlemen, I have three claims so we should agree with to this motion. So first, it can reduce action that disadvantages most of the country in the world, such as monopoly or imbalances. Second, it can reduce world conflicts between countries. And the last, it is more sustainable for our environment itself. So before we get into our argument, let's get to know on how we're gonna do this motion. I offer today's model with A, countries still have the ownership and can actually manage the resources. But the things that we want to manage from the international agencies is how to distribute and trade under the agreement that the international agencies have. And B, the country that join will follow the authority about supply transparency, the prohibition of monopoly, also follow the standard that we made as the international agencies. And the last, the international agencies work to supervise, coordinate, and also monitor on how these critical resources are gonna distribute. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into our first argument. Why we should agree with today's motion is because this motion can reduce the action of that disadvantages most of the countries in the world, such as monopoly. With this international organization or agencies, country cannot power abusing or exploited the resources and also cannot take advantages from any other rural, weaker, or smaller country. Ladies and gentlemen, this motion also can reduce the dependency between each countries that can make the country that supplies the sources have crisis, or even the country that need the resources can have an economical collapse. Because of these unbalanced distributes of critical resources, we can have a big crisis, a big waste of money, energy, and indeed a big waste of the critical or limited resources itself. Ladies and gentlemen, with our model that we propose with today's motion, it can reduce the amount of imbalances between country and even monopoly. Because the way on how to distribute is supervised and managed by an international agencies, so the distribution itself can be handled more fair and wisely. Ladies and gentlemen, our second argument is with this model we can reduce world conflicts between each countries. Conflict often happen in this world just because the mistakes of unfair distribution, the ego of wanting to dominate any natural resources that's limited, and also competition that often happen between each countries. With proposition model that we offer, we can have more stabilized economical activities in this world. With this model, we can also reduce the risk of inflation because of the greed that one country have, and unfortunately give so much bad impact to any other countries in this world too. Ladies and gentlemen, today's motion isn't just debating on how we can take advantages as much as we can from each country, but on how we can build a fairer economical activities each countries have, and also about how we can build a much more stable and harmonized world to actually guarantee our next generation lives without any conflicts that's too long and waste our resources and our rights to live instead. It also can reduce the internal countries' conflicts, such as country that can take and exploit the lands of its own people, such as the incident that happened in Indonesia, especially in Raja Ampat, where the governments want to take the people's land. We can set a standard from the international agencies to prevent that kind of incident to happen. Or B, that some small and rural countries that actually rich in their natural resources but they can't manage by themselves, our model can help them to grow their economy and help distribute their natural resources. Let's move on into our third argument, ladies and gentlemen. It is much more sustainable for our environment itself. Just like what I said, it is not just about taking advantages, but to actually guarantee on a long-term living and economical growth. With today's model, we can set standard to maximize the natural resources potential without exploiting it. The natural resources will have a standard that makes sure their continuity. An example, the Freeport company that gives bad impact to our online in Indonesia, especially in Papua, without a strict standard and supervise such as what we offer, it can create environmental damage such as what the Freeport did when they disposed their tiling waste. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take an example from the Strait of Hormuz incident where one small conflict in that area can give so much impact to the whole world. This shows that without our model and this kind of dependency, the world can face so much conflict or crisis that can lead us to such a war or many other disadvantages that we obviously don't want, right? So ladies and gentlemen, therefore, to this motion and with our model that we offer, this can give us so many advantages to build stability, harmonization, and also peace between each country. This model don't dominate the critical resources itself. Instead, we build a global authority that guarantees the stability of global economical activity that we all need. Just what we have proposed today's model can actually reduce the harm of domination in global economy, can grow the potential that any rural countries have, reduces global or international conflict, and guarantee our sustainability. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, I'm as the first speaker from the positive team proudly proposed. Thank you.